The snow lay heavy across the Ardennes that December morning, muffling the world into a cold, waiting silence. Somewhere within that silence, a young artilleryman paused over a letter home, his pencil trembling from the cold, not from fear. Outside, through the dim winter fog, the distant rumble of engines hinted that the quiet would not last. He knew that whatever came next would test more than his aim. It would test the worth of men whom an entire enemy ideology dismissed before ever seeing them fight. For years, German officers had been taught that black soldiers lacked the discipline, intelligence, and steadiness required for modern war. It was a lie repeated so often that even seasoned commanders believed it. Yet in a matter of hours, those same officers would watch their armored columns grind to a halt under the weight of American artillery fire delivered with precision that defied every racist assumption they held. What no one on either side yet understood was that these men, freezing in their foxholes and tending their heavy guns, would soon carve their names into the frozen soil around Bastogne, and in doing so, they would force the world to confront a truth written not in pamphlets or propaganda, but in fire and steel. The story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion began far from Europe's cold forests in the heat and dust of Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. Activated in August 1942, it was a segregated unit. Black enlisted men commanded mostly by white officers, a structure that mirrored a nation still divided by Jim Crow. The men who reported for duty came from the rural South, from mill towns and farming communities, carrying with them the quiet resilience of those who had long lived under the weight of inequality. They would soon be asked to master one of the most complex branches of modern warfare. Artillery was a science disguised as violence. Before a single round could be fired, the men had to calculate distance, elevation, powder, charge, wind, drift, humidity, and air pressure. A single miscalculation could send a shell hundreds of yards off target or into friendly lines. Yet the soldiers of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion learned these equations with a speed that surprised many of their instructors. In classrooms and training pits, they bent over firing tables and slide rules, memorizing ballistic curves and coefficients, until they could compute a firing solution in seconds. Intelligence had no color here. Precision demanded nothing short of excellence, and they delivered it. Beyond the mathematics lay the unforgiving labor of the guns themselves. Each M1 155mm howitzer weighed over 6 tons. Each shell weighed 95 pounds. 11 men worked in perfect sequence to send one round downrange, the loader heaving the projectile into the breech, the powderman choosing the correct charge from 7 options, the gunner aligning elevation and deflection measured in mils, the breechman sealing the chamber shut. When the command came, fire, the world shuddered, and then the crew began again. Load, aim, fire, repeat. Their movements became so precise that range officers praised their accuracy as equal to and often better than many white units training beside them. Yet Camp Gruber was more than drills and calculations. It was a place of contradictions. The army demanded extraordinary discipline and technical skill from these men, while denying them basic dignity. They slept in separate quarters, ate in separate mess halls, and entered buildings through different doors. They trained to defend a democracy that still refused them full citizenship. But they endured it with determination, knowing their performance would be judged not on fair standards, but on the expectations of skeptics waiting for them to fail. In 1944, after months of relentless training, the battalion crossed the Atlantic. On June 29th, they came ashore at Utah Beach, still littered with the wreckage of D-Day. Within hours, they were in action, firing their first combat missions in support of the infantry pushing through the Norman bocage. Every hedgerow hid danger. Every field masked German machine guns and anti-tank guns. Forward observers moved with the infantry, calling back coordinates under fire. The guns of the 323rd Field Artillery Battalion answered with a steadiness that quickly earned respect. In Brittany and at Brest, their shells cracked bunkers of reinforced concrete and shattered counterattacks before they could form. Infantry officers soon began requesting them by name. By the time autumn came, the men had built a reputation as dependable, disciplined, and deadly accurate. They had proven themselves long before the snows of the Ardennes, but the test awaiting them in December would be unlike anything they had endured. It would demand every skill they had learned, every ounce of endurance they possessed, and a level of courage no training field could prepare them for. By late October 1944, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was ordered into a quiet corner of the Ardennes, an assignment meant to offer rest after months of heavy fighting. The forests around Schönberg seemed peaceful, even pastoral, with snow beginning to gather in soft white layers along the roads and rooftops. Soldiers built sturdier cabins, strung lights for Christmas, and talked of Paris leave. It felt for the first time in months like a pause, an intermission in a war that had devoured entire nations. But the stillness was deceptive. Beneath that calm lay the staging ground for Germany's last desperate gamble. At 05:30 on December 16th, the world erupted. The opening bombardment of the Battle of the Bulge tore through the forest, turning the quiet sector into a death trap. Hundreds of German guns hammered American lines for 90 minutes. Then came the armor columns of panzers rolling out of the fog, smashing through the overstretched 106th Infantry Division. The German attack hit with such overwhelming force that entire regiments collapsed within hours. For the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the crisis unfolded with brutal speed. Battery Sable and Baker received orders to withdraw toward Bastogne, but Battery Charlie and Service Battery were told to remain in place, firing in support of American units still fighting to escape encirclement. The men who stayed understood the risk. They stayed anyway. Throughout December 16th Battery, Charlie fired non-stop missions, directing 155mm shells into German assembly areas and choke points. Their accuracy bought precious hours for infantry trying to escape the tightening German ring. But by dawn on December 17th, the battalion's eastern elements stood alone behind enemy lines. German forces surged through Schönberg, cutting off every route west. Service Battery attempted to break out only to be ambushed in the village streets. Many were killed instantly. Others were captured, herded into lines, and marched away through the snow. Battery Charlie fought until overwhelmed, his commander, Captain William MacLeod, dying beside his men. Technical Sergeant William Pritchett organized a final defense that allowed a handful to escape. He was killed, covering their withdrawal. Only 11 men from those trapped batteries managed to slip through the encirclement. Exhausted, frost-bitten, and carrying only 2 rifles, they trudged 10 miles through deep snow toward the small Belgian hamlet of Wereth. A local family, the Langer family, offered them shelter, food, warmth, and human kindness in the midst of chaos. But someone in the village, still sympathetic to Germany, informed an SS patrol. What followed became one of the darkest moments of the Battle of the Bulge. The Wereth 11, as they would later be known, surrendered peacefully. The SS marched them to a nearby field, then tortured and murdered them, executing them not for their uniforms, but for their skin. Their bodies would be found months later, frozen beneath the winter snow. No one was prosecuted, Meanwhile, the survivors of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, who had withdrawn west, reached Bastogne, cold, battered, and reduced to barely half their original strength. They carried with them the weight of what had happened at Schönberg and Vereth, but they would have little time to grieve. A greater trial awaited them in the surrounded city, where their guns would soon become one of the keystones of the American defense. When the surviving elements of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion reached Bastogne, they arrived as shadows of the unit that had landed at Utah Beach. Barely 1 to 40 men remained cold, exhausted, and carrying the weight of the dead. Yet there was no time to fall back. The German counteroffensive was converging on the city, the last major road hub in the Ardennes. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank of the Allied front would unravel. The men of the 333rd joined forces with the 969th Field Artillery Battalion and prepared for a siege that would become one of the defining moments of the Battle of the Bulge. By December 20, the city was fully encircled. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing gun pits and turning every movement into labor. Temperatures dropped below zero. Ammunition was limited 10 rounds per gun per day. Forward observers worked from frozen foxholes with the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, calling back coordinates through static and failing radio batteries. In cellars and basements, beneath the city fire direction, centers calculated firing tables by candlelight, knowing that one error could land a shell among their own men. At the gun positions, the cold was merciless. Artillery crews wore every layer they owned, but the wind still cut through them. Their hands split open on the metal rims of the shells. Their breath froze on the breech blocks. Still, when the firing commands came, the crews of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion moved with the same deliberate precision they had practiced in Oklahoma. Even under fire, even with frostbite gnawing at their fingers, they lifted 95-pound shells, set fuses, and aligned the heavy barrels with practiced calm. German attacks followed a brutal rhythm artillery preparation, then infantry and armor assaults through the swirling fog. But each time the Germans messed for an attack, American forward observers saw them, and the guns around Bastogne answered. High explosive rounds tore through German assembly areas, shattering formations before they could advance. Airburst shells detonated above trenches, raining shrapnel on men who believed themselves protected. White phosphorus ignited vehicles and sent attackers fleeing in panic. Sometimes the fighting closed to mere hundreds of yards too close for traditional indirect fire. In those moments, the artillerymen lowered their howitzers and fought in direct fire mode, aiming the massive guns like rifles. They could see the tanks coming. They could hear German machine gun rounds snapping past their heads. Yet they stayed at their posts. A well-placed shell with a super-quick fuse could rip through the side armor of a panzer, turning steel into a furnace. More than once, direct fire from the 333rd stopped German armor in its tracks. Gun barrels overheated. Recoil systems leaked fluid. Breaches froze open. Yet the crews kept their weapons alive with whatever tools they had: rags, improvised pumps, bare hands pressed against the freezing metal. There were no replacement parts, no fresh crews, no rest. Only disciplined precision and the knowledge that if the guns fell silent, the defenses around Bastogne would crumble. Through it all, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, a unit the enemy had once dismissed as inferior, held their ground. Their fire broke attacks, shattered morale, and bought time for the relief force pushing north. Their endurance in those frozen gun pits carried a weight that statistics alone could never measure. When the gunfire finally eased around Bastogne, the German High Command began compiling its after-action reports cold clinical documents meant to measure tactical performance. Yet hidden between the lines was something neither Hitler's ideology nor Wehrmacht training could reconcile. The artillery fire that shattered their attacks had come in large part from units they had been taught to dismiss. Files recovered decades later contain sentences that quietly betray this shock. One regimental commander wrote that American fire was devastating in its accuracy and that his men were broken before reaching the line. Another German report stated plainly that artillery casualties exceeded those from all other causes combined. The myth of racial superiority had collided with the mathematical precision of American gunnery and lost. For the United States, the truth was more complicated. Inside the perimeter, white paratroopers and black artillerymen had fought shoulder to shoulder. In the siege's deepest moments, there was no segregation, only survival. Veterans of the 101st Airborne later recalled the steadiness of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, remembering how their shells arrived exactly where and when needed. In the crucible of the Battle of the Bulge, respect grew where prejudice had once stood. But outside the battlefield, recognition was uneven. The defense of Bastogne earned the Presidential Unit Citation, the Army's highest unit award, and it included the battered remnants of the 333rd. Yet the fate of the Wehrmacht. 11. Black artillerymen tortured and killed after surrender received no war crimes prosecutions, no public outcry, and no official accounting. Their deaths were noted, investigated, and quietly set aside. In contrast, similar massacres of white prisoners prompted immediate trials and headlines. The silence around Wehrmacht revealed the contradictions of a nation fighting tyranny abroad while struggling with its own legacy at home. Over time, however, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Military historians examining the Battle of the Bulge consistently held up the fire discipline of black artillery units as among the best in the European theater. And in 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces, a decision shaped partly by the undeniable performance of units like the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Their accuracy, endurance, and sacrifice had demonstrated a truth that policy could no longer deny. Across the Atlantic, Belgium began honoring what America had overlooked. Monuments rose in Wehrmacht, and later in the United States, finally acknowledging the men whose courage had been buried for decades. The world, slowly and unevenly, learned to see the 333rd not through the lens of propaganda, but through the cold, undeniable logic of their actions. They fought, they held, and they proved themselves under conditions few soldiers ever face. In the decades that followed, the Battle of the Bulge, the fields around Bastogne thawed, the wreckage was cleared, and the world moved on. But the story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion did not fade so easily. It lingered quietly, insistently, because history has a way of returning to the truths written in hardship. And the truth forged by these black artillerymen in that frozen December carried a weight that no passage of time could erase. Recognition came slowly, almost reluctantly. The men who had stood their ground in Bastogne returned to a nation still divided, still unwilling to fully see them. The Wehrmacht 11 murdered in the snow for no reason beyond their skin were left unmentioned in official records. Their sacrifice slipped into silence, while other wartime atrocities received trials and condemnation. Yet the memory has a way of finding its way back. In 1994, a Belgian farmer, the boy who had once welcomed the soldiers into his family home, raised a simple stone cross bearing their names. It was quite humble and honest, a gesture of remembrance that governments had neglected. More memorials followed. In Belgium, in Massachusetts, in Illinois, and finally in the United States Congress, where resolutions acknowledged what had long been true. The 303rd Field Artillery Battalion had fought with courage equal to any American unit. They had held their lines around Bastogne, delivered the fire that shattered German assaults, and proven beyond debate that skill and discipline recognize no color. The world now speaks their names with the respect they earned, names carried from Weret, from the siege, from the frozen roads, where they pulled their guns into position under fire. Their legacy stretches far beyond the Ardennes, when Truman desegregated the US military in 1948. He did so knowing that soldiers like these had already proven the policy's necessity long before it became law. The battlefield had provided the proof. The men of the 303rd had given it. And so the question lingers for us today. What do we learn from their journey, from the snow of Weret to the gun pits of Bastogne, from injustice to recognition? Perhaps it is this, that courage does not need permission to exist, and dignity does not wait for approval. These black artillerymen earned their place in history through the simple, unyielding act of doing their duty when everything around them said they would fail. If this chapter of the Battle of the Bulge moved, you consider sharing your thoughts below. What lesson do you believe the 303rd lives for us today? And if you want to keep exploring the moments where ordinary soldiers changed the course of history, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The guns of Bastogne have long since fallen silent, but the legacy of the men who fired them, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, still echoes in the winter air.